There is supposed to be an increased attraction to sweetness that occurs at times when we have to have significant growth. But under normal circumstances, and certainly in the last 30 years, these are not normal dietary circumstances, that attraction for sweetness should start to decrease in the teen years. And we now know that if kids have an attraction for sweetness, even before they get to their teens, chances are it isn't going to go away. In mammals, our sweet receptors evolved in environments that were very low sugar. And we have not been able to adapt to the super sweet environment that we now face every day. And because of that, there has been an abnormal reward signal or pleasure signal in the brain that overrides our normal control mechanisms, our normal homeostatic balance mechanisms that should keep us on the straight and narrow. But it actually now can lead to addiction in a lot of the population. Our taste further began to develop after birth, when kids learned to then be able to distinguish bitter from sweet. And it's thought that being able to distinguish that allows kids then to begin to learn to eat foods that may not be sweet but have high enough nutritional or better nutritional value. And in the past, by the time babies were eating real food, before the super sweet environment, they would have been much less attracted to sweetness. At one stage, they would have learned how to balance the need for sweet taste with other tastes. That no longer happens. Before the wholesale use of manufactured baby foods, which are made to be sweeter on purpose, kids are no longer able to get away from that need for the sweet taste. Kids were not attracted to the taste of processed foods before. They are now. And we know that most of the processed foods are high in carbs. There have been attempts as health authorities, begin to see what's happening to the escalating statistics and costs to government and to population and to business and productivity, to start to cut down the amount of sweetness that kids are being exposed to. And international attempts have failed. One of the last times they tried to do that, to cut the percentage of sugar in baby foods down to 10%, the US and the UK did not agree. So let's talk about dopamine, because when you talk about addiction, that's one of the main neurotransmitters that you talk about when you talk about addiction to all sorts of things. It's dopamine. It's a chemical produced in the brain for communication between nerve cells. Serotonin is another neurotransmitter that's often talked about with addiction, but most of the research I read in the primary neurotransmitter is dopamine. Now, it's not only involved in our pleasure or reward circuitry in the brain, it's also involved in learning, memory, and motivation, and that's important to keep in mind. Because if you start to mess up not just your reward circuit, excuse me, but it begins to mess up these other brain functions, you can really wind up with people whose judgment can be terribly flawed. And we all know people who do have addiction problems to alcohol, to drugs, to whatever, and their judgment has been badly flawed, so they can no longer make a proper decision. So beyond pleasure, dopamine alerts the brain to pay attention to everything going on around us in order to help us survive. Dopamine is increased when we're in danger, a fearful situation. It's increased when we're in pain, a stressful situation. And it's also increased in high carbohydrate foods. But it is far more of a complex reaction than simply a feel-good chemical, which is how it's often referred to. So let's talk a little bit about what happens in the brain with addiction. The communication in the brain from one nerve cell to another occurs by the production of these chemicals, dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine, norepinephrine, a variety of others. When there is a deficit of dopamine receptors from one nerve cell to another, where the dopamine should be uptaked by another nerve cell on the receptors, there can be deficits in the numbers of receptors. When that happens, there is going to be a decrease in your pleasure circuitry, in your reward circuitry. And that's part of what sets up the whole addiction. According to research done at the U.S. Department of Energy Brookhaven Lab, they have looked at obese subjects and measured the dopamine receptors that they have, and they found that obese subjects will have fewer dopamine receptors than normal subjects. And the more obese you become, the less receptors you'll have. So you can imagine what that's going to set up with people who really cannot experience pleasure or reward from what they're eating. People can be born with fewer dopamine receptors. And they have found that fewer dopamine receptors can also occur in people with drug addiction. And keep in mind that when you're talking about one addiction, there can be cross addictions that occur. Now, one of the things I was interested in, and I could not find it, was I was wondering whether people who had a genetic tendency to type 2 diabetes, would those people perhaps have fewer dopamine receptors? Would that be one reason why they may have some difficulty in really controlling food compared to subjects who did not have a genetic tendency to diabetes? I've been unable to find that, but at least for me, I think that would be an interesting thing to know. Now, various substances can produce a rush of dopamine. I'll talk about high carbohydrate foods, sugar, alcohol, of course, cocaine, heroin, and nicotine, all of which will increase the experience of pleasure. Now, in people with fewer dopamine receptors, what you see over time, and this is one of the characteristics of addiction, is that over time, the receptors they do have become resistant to the addictive substance. So that in order to feel pleasure, it takes escalating amounts of the addictive substance in order to experience pleasure or your reward. So you can see how that starts to happen. Fewer receptors, and then they become almost like they become dopamine resistant. And you need more and more in order to experience pleasure. So let's talk a little bit about where some of the research was done. And most people would admit here that cocaine is considered to be a very highly addictive substance. Do you agree? From everything you hear, everything you read, it doesn't take much before you can become addicted. So they had rats. They had some healthy rats, those who didn't have addiction problems, and then they had cocaine-addicted rats. They were put in their environment, and they had a choice to freely take sugar-sweetened water or cocaine-laced water. And it was ad lib, whatever they wanted. What they found was that the rats who were not addicted would go to the sugar-sweetened water, but so did the cocaine-addicted rats. Instead of going to the cocaine, they would go to the sugar. For them, it was still a stronger need. And when the researchers made it more difficult for the rats to get to the sugar-laced water, the rats were still willing to go through more difficulty to get to the sugar than the cocaine. I was shocked by that. So were a lot of other people shocked by it. But I think that tells us why some of us really get in trouble with sugar. And in the lab rats, they found the same thing that you can find with other addictions, behaviors that are related to addictions, including carbs, binging, withdrawal when you stop it, cravings, which often then leads you to go back to your addictive food, or a substitute. Dopamine can be released by increased glucose in the brain. So we've talked in these few days that high carbs, your glucose goes up in the brain. You can get a dopamine release, but this is even more important in my view. There is sensory input from the mouth. So even a sweet taste in the mouth can begin that process of increasing dopamine. So my concern is people use a lot of artificial sweeteners. It may not contain calories, but it's the sweet taste. And how much of that in a susceptible individual might very well begin this whole process of addiction to things that even taste sweet. This is just from my observations doing thousands and thousands of medical histories at the Atkins Center over the years. What we used to do is, of course, ask family history about diabetes in the family. We had many patients came to us thinking they had reactive hypoglycemia, which we've talked about in the last couple days. And you often found alcoholism in the same families. So you can see a cross addiction between sugar and alcohol.